It's wonderful to be young again. Thank you for that, Haifa. I'd like to thank Haifa and Michelle for inviting me back to Birmingham. I seem to be spending rather more time here than I ever would have thought likely. And thank you in particular for the sequence of the papers following on from the next president of Egypt adds to the challenge of saying anything meaningful on this topic in the sort of time available. I guess anybody trying to talk about this set of events, the so-called Arab Spring, and it's become yet another so-called, like the so-called war on terror and the so-called peace process, we now have the so-called Arab Spring. I don't know what the acronym is. If somebody would come up with it quickly, it might save me time. But obviously, try to make sense in relation to any context in the sort of time available of what's going on is impossible, plainly impossible. But I'll try to say something meaningful about what's been happening in Yemen. And as the as the title of the paper on which this talk is based suggests, that tension, if it is even a tension between democratic opening and regime maintenance, lies at the heart of what I'm going to say. And as will become very clear, it seems to be the case that there are far more grounds for concluding that what's going on in Yemen, what has happened in Yemen in the last few months, constitutes something much closer to regime maintenance than democratic opening, despite the extraordinary events that have taken place. So, on the face of it, what you have in Yemen is the fourth success of this wave of revolt revolutionary movements at the end of last year, November 2011, the signing in Saudi Arabia of the GCC-sponsored deal, which saw Ali Abdullah Saleh, the long-time president of Yemen, weren't they all long-time presidents since 1990, since the modern state of Yemen came into existence, undertake to leave the country, to hand over, not to leave the country, he did leave the country, but for different reasons, to hand over power to his deputy president, Abdurrahman Mansour al-Hadi, I nearly forgot his name, as a prelude, A, to presidential election, B, to the formation of a transitional unity government in Yemen. So you get yet another, you've got Ben Ali gone, Mubarak gone, Gaddafi gone, and now Ali Abdullah Saleh. End of story. The democratic revolt in Yemen is triumphant. What I want to suggest, of course, is that as with all of these cases, nothing is yielded by the nothing significant in terms of analysis is yielded by the simplifications of that sort of Arab Spring analogy, that 1989 analogy, and so on and so forth. What we really need to do in all of these cases is look at context, look at the arrangement, if you like, of political forces in individual countries. And in the case of Yemen, it seems to me that context is crucial on so many different levels. It's crucial in terms of the socioeconomic background of the country, the very significant challenges on that level that face the country. It's crucial in terms of the fact of ongoing and significant challenges, if you like, to central authority in the country, which long predate the events of 2011. It's crucial as well in terms of understanding how local political actors, regional actors, notably Saudi Arabia, and international actors, in particular the United States, have in effect come together to generate a solution, as it were, to the crisis afflicting Yemen last year, which seems on the face of it to change very little and to leave an awful lot in place, as was. So I'm going to try very, very quickly to say some of those things. In the first instance, in terms of the Yemeni context, the more one thinks about it, the more depressing it becomes. Yemen is far and away, it is quite exceptional by regional standards and by Arab standards. It's far and away the poorest country in the Arab world. It's the country with the highest and very high levels of illiteracy, male and female. It ranks very low on all of the indices of gender equity. It ranks very high on all indices of corruption. Its economy is overwhelmingly dependent on a very limited oil industry. Something like 90% of exports are generated by the oil industry. Government spending is almost entirely dependent on oil. oil is running out very quickly. According to some estimates, by 2015. The population is growing faster than anywhere else in the Arab world. It's now around 5 million, it'll be 40 million soon. Again, these sorts of projections are variable, but the direction of the trend is quite clear. So rapidly increasing population, rapidly declining oil resources on which the economy is almost entirely dependent. But it gets worse because the country is also running out of water. And indeed, rapidly so it seems as well. So on the socioeconomic and resource level, nothing but crisis. In terms of the political background, Yemen is also exceptional in the post-1990, with the coming together of the Yemen Arab Republic and the PDRY, the former Marxist-Leninist South. You have the emergence of a very, very unusual, if not unique, experiment in political liberalisation that lasted for 3 or 4 years. A multi-party political system, constitution guaranteeing rights of suffrage to men and women, flourishing of civil society, dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum, you can kind of work out the rest. That came to an end somewhat in 1994 when the simmering unrest between the old South and the North erupted into civil war. And after 1994 you get a clampdown, it's the sort of deliberalisation that Eberhard Kienle has described in relation to Egypt, and indeed as has taken place elsewhere. Nonetheless, Yemen still has a more meaningful plural political system than is the case elsewhere in the Gulf, at least. But as I said, there are, in terms of background, there are also threats to the centralised state has never extended its reach throughout the territory of the country. And particularly over the last several years, you have the dual challenges of posed by southern discontent, particularly after that short-lived civil war, which has emerged in the form of what's sometimes referred to as the Iraq movement. A move towards either greater decentralization, federalism, or sometimes outright separatism in the south, the insurrection in Sada, the Houthi insurrection in the north, and you can throw into the mix the activities, greatly overestimated as they usually are, of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, but not insignificant for all that they are greatly overestimated. That's some of the background. In terms of that plural political system, what you have in Yemen then is a dominant party, as you see in much else of the Arab world and the General People's Congress, but also a surprisingly lively opposition landscape, if you like, and an unusually long-lived coalition of opposition forces, of Islamists, in the form of the Islam Party, which emerged post-unification in 1990, and the Yemeni Socialist Party of the South. So you have this unusual left Islamist alliance, and despite the fact that both of these forces were actually at war with each other during that 1994 civil war. Okay. The protest movement that emerged at the beginning of last year emerged, as it did elsewhere, from outside established political actors, from outside the established political parties, established civil society actors, and so on and so forth. It was that classic youth-led, leaderless movement. Initially small in scale. Initially the opposition parties were quite suspicious and quite wary of becoming involved. The opposition parties, which particularly the Islamists, have always maintained, at least among some of their number, close links with the ruling regime. But the movement grew, and gradually both the Houthis, the separatists in the south, and elements of the opposition parties joined the opposition to the GTC and to Ali Abdullah Saleh. In March, and this seems to have happened at different junctures in different contexts in terms of these revolts, but in March of last year, the regime violently attacked protesters in Sana'a, and dozens, if not more, of protesters were killed. The result of that was a series of defections from the ruling party, but also other significant shifts in alliance, if you like. So you get the defection from support of the ruling regime of one of the senior military commanders in the in the country. You get the defection of the leading figures in the largest tribal confederation in Yemen. And you get the increasing isolation, if you like, of the regime of Ali Abdullah Saleh in particular. On the other hand, from the point of view of those who initially led this revolt, insofar as a leaderless revolt can have leaders, the fact that it was increasingly being dominated by the Islah Party, that it was increasingly being dominated by defectors from the regime, led to huge concerns at their marginalisation. And indeed, this is the history then of what follows through, because from comparatively early on last year, you get initiatives undertaken by the Gulf Cooperation Council with a very strong interest from Saudi Arabia, but also a significant interest in what was to ensue on the part of the US. And the GCC initiative is an initiative that was undertaken in dialogue between the GCC and the established opposition parties, and of course the GPC. At no point are the youth protesters in the squares, in Sana'a, in Taiz, in Aden, anywhere else. Holy moly. I presume that's 15. It must be a mistake. Are they included in this process? And it would, of course, have been virtually impossible for this to happen, because these are, by definition, groups and individuals who don't have political background, who, because they're not part of established political parties, lack the available opportunities, if you like, to intercede with power brokers. Some of them belatedly began to organise themselves. Some had some affiliation with political parties, but these were marginal in terms of their commitment to radical or indeed revolutionary change in Yemen. So what you get is, in a sense, I won't say a stitch-up, but you certainly get something much more like elite bargaining, rather than any reflection of the sorts of transformative demands that the youth movement or movements in the squares had been demanding. Central to this, of course, to the ways in which this evolved, central to this were the interests of Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis, of course, having a very significant, very extensive border with Yemen, which was demarcated and finally agreed, I think, only as recently as the year 2000, alarmed by the Zaidi Shia Houthi insurrection in the north, so hugely concerned about the stability of the country. And Saudi, of course, having a long history of involvement, interference in Yemeni politics, to the extent that at one point, perhaps no longer, but at one point, a very significant number of leading political actors in government and opposition parties and indeed tribal forces were in receipt of a monthly stipend from the Saudi ministry concerned with Yemeni affairs under the Ministry of the Interior. And on the other hand, you have the concern of the United States, an overstated concern with radical Islamism, with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, despite the fact that there seems to be a general consensus shared by many in the US military, if recent reports are to be believed, that this is a very, very limited phenomenon indeed in terms of its support base amongst the Yemeni population. But nonetheless, a concern which is expressed in terms of significant amounts of military assistance to the Yemeni regime, in particular significant military assistance to elements within the military regime that are controlled by members of Ali Abdullah Saleh's family, his son and his nephew. Which brings me to the GCC deal, about which I'm going to say just a couple of things. The first is that the deal, contrary to the demands of the youth protesters, guaranteed Ali Abdullah Saleh and his family immunity from prosecution for their various crimes. It left family members in control of significant elements of the security apparatus. It confirms the preeminent position of the established political parties, seen by many Yemenis as bereft of any meaningful program for remedying the extraordinary challenges that face the country. So in essence, what you get is the abstraction of the former president, but the maintenance of very much else that was in place in the country 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years ago. As I said, outside of the formal opposition parties, you have a protest movement that continues, but that is internally divided. Within the formal opposition parties, you have divisions both within the opposition coalition, the joint committee parties, and divisions within the component members of that coalition, all of which offers, if you like, greater scope for the marginalisation of those concerned with real and significant and transformative change in Yemen, which I would suggest has been the end result of the GCC deal. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you.